Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today shall be economy and enterprise in Indian culture. For this very discussion and lecture, we have thus in our studio Dr. Shankar Kumar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Hindu College, University of Delhi. And friends, with this introduction, we welcome sir and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you, Urvashi. Good morning, viewers. As you can make out, today's lecture is not only on economy, but there is another word associated with it, and that is enterprise. Now, why this enterprise word assumes importance, particularly with reference to Indian culture, is on account of some kind of a charge that is labeled against Indian, particularly on account of the historical baggage that Indian culture carries. And it is in this particular sense that we would be taking forward our today's discussion with reference to economy and enterprise. My perspective would be distinctly historical on account of my formal training in the subject, and I shall try to locate the points, the nodal points from where we can take some kind of a clue as to how and in what ways the economy and also the risk-taking ability and the you can say organizational capacity of people in terms of human as well as natural resources, capital, technology, and so forth, how they managed it, how they leveraged it to their advantage in some kind of a competition, and they made some kind of forays into areas which were not very conventional from the time frame of discussion that we shall be adopting and indicating during our discussion. So, with reference to this, of course, this word economy is self-evident, and we shall be talking about the origins of this term as well and its pertinence to Indian culture, and try to understand as to how it unfolded and unpacked in Indian history, giving rise to some tendencies which are still present or which need to be overcome in the present times on account of challenges posed and so forth. Of the charge that I just mentioned in the beginning, it is said that we are somewhat loath to changes, and our ability or our record in terms of technological innovations and risk taking, which is a very dominant component of enterprise, is somewhat limited. And it is on account of that we could not quite have something like the scientific revolution that was witnessed in 16th, 17th century Europe, and also the way industrialization was embarked upon in England and in other Western European countries. India somewhat lagged behind. And there are wonderful researches, articles exhibiting the potentialities of capitalist development in the 18th century India, when the British had already started making inroads into not only Indian economy, but also had started taking control of Indian polity on a limited scale, and subsequently they spread out to other parts of India from Bengal and so forth. So, these are some of the issues that we shall be trying to take up. Also important is the growth and development of several institutions. For instance, some institutions related to agriculture, some institutions related to trade and economic activity, artisanal activity, the institutions which financed it, the educational institutions where such expertise could be transmitted across generations and so forth. So how it all unfolded in Indian history, and what kind of tendencies it gave rise to, which impact the present generation of we as Indians as well. So these are this constitutes the scope of our discussion. Now, if we talk of the initial charge and try to associate it in the context in which it emerged, it is primarily coming from the fact which is somewhat historical. Now, let's understand that modern machines or mechanization as such of Indian economy started happening in a big way at a time in Indian history which was distinctly colonial. And the political context of this gave some kind of an impression that it is coming with the intent to replace human labor, and therefore a kind of fear gripped the working class as such, the professionals also down the ladder in terms of economic hierarchy. And this created a kind of negative attitude towards mechanization and introduction of modern technology in the realm of economy as such. Now, partly this is true as well, because this tendency is not something which is unique to our experience as a colonial country, as a country which was under colonialism, but even in the countries where it originally came, say in England or in other Western European countries, the initial impact was something which did create some kind of a flutter in the intelligentsia as well as the working class, the labor class. And we can see that even in European literature of 19th century and early, the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, where the response to the introduction of big machines and the dehumanizing tendencies and the city life is something which is painted not in a very favorable way. And on the top of that, if we take the Indian situation, there was this colonial context and the political struggle against colonialism for independence and some kind of autonomy for shaping the destiny of our own country by ourselves, and also shaping the economy in the ways and adopting means which are perhaps more suitable to our culture and history and so forth. So this is the historical context in which this kind of a tendency, this kind of an attitude could have crystallized, and one has to constantly try and brush it away or try to move beyond this, because of course post independence we have moved on and we have sought to make the future of our own country in ways and means which are completely autonomous so far as decision making is concerned, and also it tries to leverage some of the advantages that we as a country do have in terms of manpower, in terms of natural resources, the competitive advantage that we have in some segments of economy and so forth. So that is the context of the usual charge that is made against us, the Indians, with respect to lack of enterprise, with respect to lack of the ability of risk taking, and so forth. Also, the broad historical backdrop of Asiatic mode of production, in which the Western colonial scholars initially painted Indian or for that matter entire Oriental history as such, which was averse to change, which was a changeless kind of a society, again goes on to buttress the same very notion of the absence of enterprise to the required degree, so far as Indians were concerned, so far as the Indian scenario was concerned. But as we have already seen, that the pith and substance and also the intent of such kind of a charge is basically on account of colonial compulsions. So today we can understand as to how the dynamics of this kind of a charge must have been operational in those times, and how it has given to this kind of a fallacious notion of the absence of risk-taking ability, or the absence of the ability of the Indians to organize or pool together their resources in a particular way in order to meet a particular target, a particular project as such, in order to execute it, in order to negotiate with the challenges of the times and so forth. And it is in this context that we shall try to look at Indian history, the instances of such constraints, and how there are examples from within the Indian history where such problems were navigated through, where such problems were circumvented. We also will try to have a good look at several institutions related to agriculture, trade, technology, education, and so forth, which played critical role in fostering enterprise, the sense of enterprise, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the kind of charge that is labeled at risks. One should be averse to risk taking and so forth. Now, since this lecture is also about economy and the kind of attitude that we have towards some works and so forth, therefore, we shall also be trying to look at some of the attitudes. At times in Indian history, we do see some negativity creeping up towards, say, overseas travels, or manufacturing, or for that matter some particular occupations which are not accorded the kind of value that they deserve, despite these occupations being very critical to economy. Yet in terms of social hierarchy, in terms of social esteem, there was some kind of you can say some kind of disincentiveness associated with particular jobs. But also important is the fact that these attitudes, quite contrary to the conventional notion, we would discover in the course of our discussion that they were not stationary attitudes. They kept changing over a period of time, and with the change in the mainstream economy and also economy encompassing new areas of the Indian subcontinent in Indian history, we find that these attitudes did undergo some kind of a change, and it is not on account of some kind of an invariable constant that we should be understanding such attitudes. So they are born of some circumstances, and we shall try to locate those circumstances, and we shall also try to see that with the changing circumstance, these attitudes again withered away, or other attitudes which were more positive towards these activities, economic activities, these professions, and also enterprise, sense of enterprise, they were always present. I mean, so it is in the overall context that we shall try and explore the instances of all these. So far as agriculture itself is concerned, the beginning, why I begin with agriculture is because, again, even if we see today, despite the progressively reducing value of agriculture, or for that matter primary sector in the overall GDP of India, particularly post-independence, the fact remains that a majority of our population still is dependent on agriculture, rather directly subsists on agriculture, and that is huge. So more than 60% of the population in the present times in India do subsist. Their basic livelihood is on agriculture and related primary activities. And although, as I said, that the value contribution in terms of GDP has progressively been declining, which is again regarded as a marker of economic development as such. But what is noteworthy from the historical point of view is that so far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned, if we keep aside the prehistoric past, where of course particularly towards the last stage of prehistoric past in the Neolithic stage, we started having instance of agriculture and continued agriculture and a variety of crops getting grown in domesticated conditions in the Indian subcontinent. The world scale keeps it at around 8000 BC, or it can be stretched to 10,000 BC, particularly in West Asia and Egypt and so forth. But so far as the Indian subcontinent is concerned, definitely around 7000 BC, we do have almost indisputable evidence of cultivation happening, particularly at a site called Mehergarh, which is in present day Pakistan. And wheat and barley were definitely grown, and there could be instances of several other crops and animal domestication. So it is the combination of the two which triggered the process of or the possibility of surplus generation in terms of food output, and which was at the base of several institutional developments which unfolded not in a continuous fashion, but very much subsequent to the Neolithic phase in this area, in the same area, that is in the Indus Valley and the present day Pakistan, Jammu Kashmir, Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat area, even western Uttar Pradesh and some parts of Maharashtra. We have a complex of very civilizational matrix taking shape around 2500 BC in its mature phase, in its urban phase, in its developed phase, in the form of Harappan civilization. And all of us know that the major centers of Harappan civilization, major towns of Harappan civilization had huge granaries, which again indisputably proves that there is enough generation of agrarian surplus. And this generation of agrarian surplus in a big way must have entailed some kind of an organizational capacity at the social and economic level also. It is not merely about producing food or doing cultivation on fields, but there are several associated dimensions like the technological development, the social organizational and political organizational development. Although in the absence of written records, there is not much we can say with a sense of exactitude as to how it could have actually evolved, particularly with reference to the fact that for the contemporary Bronze Age civilizations elsewhere, be it Mesopotamia, be it Egypt, we do have written records which inform us about the way labor was utilized, the way slaves or slavery as an institution could have been helpful in putting in a lot of labor, resulting in some architectural iconic structures also. In the case of Harappa, we don't have such direct evidence to prove the way labor was organized, particularly on account of the absence of written records. Nevertheless, the sheer level of advancement and refinement that the city life of Harappan times they indicate that the organization at the labor level, the organization at the political level or economic level must have been equally refined and equally developed in order to make this a reality. In terms of technology, of course, we do admit that iron plowshare was still not used during the Harappan times, and resultantly the semi-arid environment in which this civilization grew, there must have been some kind of a natural limit to the agrarian output, and therefore there must have been some kind of a cap on the population carrying capacity of these agrarian sites in the vicinity of major cities or the city hinterland, so to say. Because in the absence of iron plowshare, one could not dig deep into the soil, into the surface soil, and therefore the subsoil moisture could not be utilized for cultivation purpose beyond a limit. And we all know that the average rainfall around this area, Harappa Mohenjo-daro area, is not more than 40 centimeter per annum, and that again restricts the kind of crops which can be grown in this area. But also important is the fact that there are evidence of channels, there are evidence of bunds or you can say dams, which indicate that artificial irrigation was resorted to, and the fact that cotton was grown in this area also testify to the fact that if in this semi-arid situation such crops were grown and grown repeatedly over a long period of time, giving rise to a civilizational complex like that of the Indus Valley or Harappa, one must understand that these techniques of water management must have been fairly advanced. Of the recently excavated site of Dholavira in Gujarat, which is an Indus Valley site, we get a very good specimen of the water management, the way it was carried out. The gradient of the land was perhaps understood and utilized, and we have very finely worked out water channels for the purpose of drinking as well as cultivation in this largely semi-arid area. So this is something which usually we don't recognize and acknowledge, that quite a few Harappan sites are located in areas which are not very habitable sites. In terms of, particularly from the point of view of the ancient times that we are talking of, 3000, 2000 BC. There are several Harappan sites on Makran coast, which is facing the Arabian Sea, and the rainfall water virtually gushes out into the sea, and the winds, the desert-like wind in this area is also enormous. The subsoil water in several of the run of Kutch area, where again we find quite a few Harappan sites, are definitely not sweet water, and yet we have settlements over there. So the rationale behind these settlements could have been strategic, or it could have been political, and that goes on to show the ingenuity of people in those times, and the efforts, the kind of management that they might have resorted to in order to make collective life a possibility even in inhospitable conditions. So these are some of the instances from where we can draw some examples of enterprise, although the actual contours of the story is not known to us on account of the unavailability or non-decipherment of the Harappan script. Moving on, if we come to around, say, Vedic times, the Rigvedic times, again we find that it is, to begin with, it is a pastoral society which heavily depended on shepherds, which heavily depended on animal resources, cattle and so forth. If you look at the vocabulary of the Rigvedic text, or some of the critical terms, quite a few of these terms have their root in the word cow, that is go, and that again goes on to prove the importance of the Pashudhan or pastoralism in their everyday life. And but again, being probably not so familiar with agriculture, these Aryans who came and settled in the Sapta Sindhu area in the northwestern part of India, by the time we reach the end of the Rigvedic period, that is around 1000 BC, or we can say the beginning of the later Vedic times, we start getting instances of people getting socialized with the idea of agriculture, and several new professions, several new artisanal activities started creeping in to these later Vedic texts, be it the later portion of Rigveda, or even Atharvaveda and Samveda and several other later Vedic texts. And again, this is symptomatic of a society which is not very averse to change. This is symptomatic of a dynamic society at work. This is, if we move beyond the instances of small skirmishes which are very much present in the Vedic texts, beneath this is the ever ongoing process of these communities probably interacting with other local communities who had been inhabiting this area from earlier times, and resultantly they are also now taking to new ways and means of earning their livelihood, agriculture being the prime example. So later Vedic texts are replete with operations and implements, and also several offerings which involve grains and agriculture. And over a period of time, agriculture went on to become the mainstay of Indian economy, particularly in North India Gangetic belt. And again, in terms of technology, we find iron becoming more and more important, to the extent that probably by around 800, 700 BC, it started being used even in production purpose. So even in cultivation, in the area of cultivation, iron probably started being used, and by the time we reach 6th century BC, which by some historians is regarded as the axial period of ancient India, we find the entire landscape had completely transformed. in terms of not only economy but also the complexity of social and political life. So we have new historical, we can say, actors dotting the map of North India in 6th century BC. It was transformed from a largely rural landscape to an area which had several urban centers spread in different parts of the Gangetic belt and also beyond, and the associated technological changes. The associated socio-economic changes, several institutions. For instance, this is also the time when coins, metallic coins, for the first time makes its entry in Indian history, which we know as punch-marked coins. And interestingly, these coins are not issued by royal agencies. And this again goes on to display the ingenuity of people and the ability of us, the Indians, to come together and devise ways and means to make transactions easy, to make business easy, to devise ways which are actually innovations and new, unregistered in the past, but very much part of Indian history from here on. And this is not only with reference to coins or metallic coins, but several institutions also. And this reminds me of the narrative around the root word for the term economy. It is believed that the root for the word economy is the Greek term, which is picked up from around 7th, 8th century BC in Greek history itself, where the society was making a transition from supposedly the Dark Age to again some kind of a revivalism and some kind of a spurt in agricultural production around 6th century BC, around the time Homer and Odyssey are associated. And it is in this context that the word oikos is spoken of, and this is a kind of social economic institution which conveyed the sense of a household. And this household did not include merely the people living together as one domestic unit, but also the possessions, the land that the family owned, the people, the labor that went into that particular piece of land for cultivation, the cattle which were used for cultivation purpose and so forth. So it conveyed a sense of some kind of a household management, this word oikos, and that is regarded as the root for the word economics. So in a very general sense, economics, the ethos of the historical ethos of economics as a subject is somewhat located in household management. But let's try and see as to what is happening around the same time in Indian history. And we find around 6th century BC emergence of a new category of social group, which is referred to in the contemporary texts in India as Gahapatis or Grihapatis. So the Pali equivalent would be Gahapati and Sanskrit equivalent would be Grihapati. And as the word suggests, it is about the owner of the household, the main person in the household. Usually they used to be the senior most person or the mukhya of a particular household. And it of course was an extended family that we are talking of, and it is again spoken of in the 6th century BC that these Gahapatis played a very important role in having that much of surplus and using it for trade purpose also. So this is again symptomatic of the emergence of an institution which not only manages the household production from cultivation point of view, but is also pushing into the realm of urban economy, or we can say trade economy. So this institution is of critical value so far as the term enterprise is concerned, so far as enterprising tendencies in ancient India is concerned. And the point that we were talking about with reference to the punch-marked coins and the fact that these punch-marked coins in 6th century BC and even thereafter, even as late as up to the Mauryas, they continued to be issued by agencies other than the state. Today, we generally associate minting of coins or issuing of coins as some kind of a sovereign right of the monarch, of the ruler, and it is almost regarded as some kind of a marker of sovereignty. And no one else can dare to mint their own coins, because it will cut into the idea of political sovereignty. But in ancient India, we find that the first metallic coins actually were the products of non-state agencies, and it were probably the trade guilds or the shrenis, as they were called in the contemporary texts, who minted these coins and who probably made use of these coins for transactional purposes, to ensure long distance exchange of goods, and also to ensure some kind of a safety or some kind of a mark of quality so far as their merchandise are concerned. We are told of rich caravans of traders and merchants crisscrossing several long distance trade routes, noticeably the Uttara Path and Dakshina Path in ancient Indian history. And how this exchange was actually facilitated is through not only these coins, but also several other institutions which probably worked at the behest of these traders. These shrenis that I am talking of, which are born of 6th century BC context, are also into the task of maintaining some kind of a monopoly in certain segments of their operations. For instance, if it is a shreni or guild of woodmakers, then it would ensure that the same price is maintained by all the producers of wood. Similarly, if it is say a shreni or a trade guild or a manufacturing guild of ironsmiths, then it would maintain some kind of a level playing field for all the ironsmiths. We are also told of some kind of intervention by these guilds in the realm of pricing of goods. So the price was also fixed and maintained by these trade guilds, so that some kind of a sanity is prevailing in the market or in the segments that they are operating. We are also told that these representatives of trade and manufacturing guilds sought to interact with the king in order to ensure their traditional rights and their monopoly, and over a period of time it also acquired some kind of a hereditary structure and hereditary control. And all these are happening at a level which is beyond the state, and gradually we find that the state is trying to engage these trade guilds and so forth, and they have not been able to take away their right to mint coins for a significantly long duration of time. And if we take the beginning from 6th century BC, what is very interesting is the iconic empire, the first empire builders of India, that is the Mauryas, who came to power in the 4th century BC and continued all through the 3rd century, and also a good part of 2nd century BC. Their political presence was virtually pan-Indian, barring the peninsular South Indian states like Tamil Nadu, present-day Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Virtually the entire subcontinent was under their political command. We are also told of the centralized character of their rule, of course, which is being debated in the recent times to the contrary. But the fact remains that despite all these talks of huge empire and hugely bureaucratized and centralized nature of their rule, the coin making or the mint or minting responsibility was still vested with the guilds, the trading guilds or the manufacturing guilds, and it was not the responsibility of the state. So Mauryans did not have or did not issue their own coins as such. It were the trading bodies, corporate trading bodies, which probably over a period of time had become hereditary as well. They were the ones who took it upon themselves to manage their own affairs. Of course, they had to pay certain degree of their profit as revenue to the state, as tax to the state agency. Nevertheless, it was at their behest, it was at their level that such corporate institutions and organizations came up with a task as critical as that of issuing a coins, manufacturing a coin, and circulating it and transacting business through it. So this is one segment that we have focused on, which highlights the ingenuity of the people or even the agencies beyond the state. And as we move on in the next part of the lecture on some other day, we will see what is the role of the state or several other agencies and what kind of attitudes that these enterprising instances in Indian past encountered or gave rise to. So that is it for the day, and we shall take it up in the future course of our discussion.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. And friends, as sir has already mentioned that we shall take it up from here and include this in our discussion in our next lecture. So with this, we take your leave, and thanks, sir, for being here. Thank you so much, sir. It is very kind of you to come here and talk to our viewers and students who would be greatly benefiting from this idea of economy and enterprise in Indian culture. So friends, with this, thank you so much and have a great day.